All right, so let's go to this article in the Atlantic. When you read the title, it's like the all-American city. It looks like it's a puff piece for Phoenix, but by the time you get done, it's a hit job. I have said to both of you, I've been through this before, and I was mayor during the period of time that the Barron's article came out. I always thought that it was like bad luck. I became mayor, and like a few months later, the Barron articles comes out that says Boomtown goes bust. But East Coast press loves to beat up on Phoenix. There are some issues in there that I think are worthy of spending some time on. The water issue is one that I may spend an entire show on because I think that water is always important. Although, if you look at the history of Arizona, there is no better state at being able to deal with the water issues than Arizona has been. We have been very good at that in our past. And I think sometimes, while you shouldn't take that for granted, I think we will find a way to be able to solve the challenges that we face. In fact, I'm positive we will. But there were other things that they pointed out that I thought were important for us to deal with. And so I'm going to kind of go through them just one at a time here. Henry, I know your children are in charter schools. One of the attacks was how charter schools is kind of a big negative for Arizona, the amount of money that we've diverted off into that area and the challenge it's created. I'd love to have your thoughts on that, especially I believe your wife works with one of the charter schools.
Yeah, the narrative on the charter schools in the Atlantic piece was a little bit mixed because he was actually praising a Hispanic family from Phoenix whose daughter was really excelling in one of the charter schools in Phoenix, but the tone was not one of celebrating the student's success, but sort of saying what a shame that that happened in a charter school rather than in a public school, which I guess somehow would be better. But the reality is that the school choice movement and the charter schools have been a huge success in Phoenix, and not only in Phoenix, but in the rest of the state as well. And they've been a success nationwide. You know, the most recent research or the best research out of Stanford on this issue showed that charter schools are generating significantly better results for students, even when you control for the income of the students and their racial and socioeconomic background, which is one of the main critiques of charter schools, that they kind of cherry pick the best students, leaving all the others for the district schools. So I thought the piece was a little incoherent actually to praise the success of this one young girl, but at the same time just to sort of say that it was not legitimate because it had occurred in a charter school. It didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Bob, in the past, you wrote an article a long time ago that had a big effect on how I saw education. You pointed out that in education, if you adjust for children who speak English as a second language, it really begins to have a dramatic effect on where we are in terms of our spending versus our ranking. Um, Again, on the charter schools, I believe you've been a supporter, but I'd love your thought on the educational issue.
Like Henry, I found the whole piece confusing. It sort of reminded me of Winston Churchill's line complaint that there's no theme to this pudding. Um, just to the extent it had a point, I think it was that our toxic politics may not allow us to solve our water problem, and that's somehow a metaphor for the future of the whole country. But on education, Arizona schools have always gotten a bum rap. If you disaggregate student groups and compare like students to like students, our performance on national tests have been at or above the national average. And if you look at charter students as a whole, they actually are some of the highest performing in terms of test scores on the nationally administered test in the entire country. Um, and while I am willing to accept that our schools could use additional funding, at one point in time, one of the originators of one of our major charter schools told me that they were running on fumes, and I would rather have schools not having to run on fumes. But public education in Arizona is much better than generally given credit for, and additional money isn't always the answer. And I the the use of this one family, where he seemed, his problem seemed to be that the charter system hadn't welcomed necessarily transgendered kids, and he did, but had a classical education. So his dilemma was, well, can't we have both? Well, yeah, there are plenty of charter schools in which transgendered schools or kids are openly accepted. My son taught at one. So the whole idea of school choice is that you find the fit that's best for the kid. And in Arizona, it has worked.
All right. Do you think I agree with you on the big theme? He talked about heat. He talked about water. It was really difficult to figure out what his point was, other than maybe a couple of month vacation in Phoenix, which is a great place to vacation if you come from New York. But it seems like the point he was trying to make was our political system is a wreck. We've been overrun by MAGA extremists, and that I would guess that means that we're doing much worse than the rest of the nation in terms of our politics. Now, you and I, maybe all three of us, have been supporters of reform, and I'm a big supporter of political reform. But I'm not altogether sure I buy into the idea that Arizona is worse than anyone else on this topic.
Well, I do think our Republican Party has been more thoroughly captured by the worst parts of the MAGA movement, but they've been punished electorally for that. They've lost every important statewide office. And his point, to the extent I could gather one, was that our toxic politics will make it difficult for us to, or impossible for us to solve our water problem. And we're going to dry up and blow away. And that's a metaphor somehow for the future of the entire country. The irony of this is that despite the toxicity of our politics, water is the one subject on which there is still productive bipartisan discussions going on. They didn't yield agreement in time to be enacted in the last legislative session, but there was meaningful progress made, and both sides say so. So paradoxically, where he said our toxic politics might cause our existential extinction, is one area where, despite what's happened to the Republican Party, there's still highly productive discussions and negotiations going on.
All right. I put together a little video, and we'll get some comments after that. Let's put up the slides here. So what I did, obviously this guy took on Phoenix. I used to be the mayor of Phoenix, so I can't help myself but feeling a little more defensive than them. But this promo piece that he did, in my opinion, was just really a hit job. You can read it in The Atlantic. The Atlantic is a little more of a left-leaning group, but they're also kind of a defender of New York. And if you really want to know what it is that that this author in Atlantic is doing, is they're really worried not about what's happening in Phoenix. They're worried about what's happening in New York. Now, in New York, one of the great places that we love in Phoenix is New York, because a lot of people leave New York and move to Phoenix. But if you look at a latest poll that was done by Newsweek, it talks about there being millions of New Yorkers who may be planning to leave. In fact, 7.5 million New Yorkers plan to leave the state. That is 37% of all New Yorkers. 48% of those are Republicans. That one I might have guessed. The one that surprised me, though, is this next one, which is that's 29% of the Democrats. So we decided in the Optimistic American, being they sent a reporter here, the Optimistic American sent me there. I'm not really a reporter. I probably should have sent Bob, but nonetheless, we've had kind of a lot of fun with New York over the years. In fact, one of my favorite times with New York is when the Phoenix Suns played the Knicks, although most of the New Yorkers that live here call them the Knocks because they're constantly getting knocked out of the playoffs, so it's been upsetting to them for many, many decades. But nonetheless, it is a little bit more than a game on this one, so we decided to take this on. Now, here's the key. You cannot look at anything without comparing it to something else, right? And so if you just look at Phoenix and absentia, you come up with criticism, and you can do that in any city in the country, but you need to compare it to other places. So what I did is I did a comparison to New York. So the question is, why are people leaving New York? Now, the first one is, my observation would be, they're leaving New York because of the heat. The heat's really bad in New York. When I was there, I heard about how bad the heat was here. I hit the heat wave. It was incredibly hot. It was like 95 degrees. The water that's coming out of that spigot, it could have been the precipitation and the humidity that was there. I mean, it was unbelievably hot. Of course, they were also very concerned, or the author was very concerned, about how the heat has an effect on the homeless in Phoenix. Now, the homeless is a serious issue. I spent many, many years working on the homeless issue, so I don't want to play that down any. But when you go to New York, one of the things that you will see is that New Yorkers have a lot of homeless, but they go down into the subways, because in the subways, they actually can sometimes get air conditioning. But there, the homeless has something different to worry about. You'll see in this video here in a second that we put up.
Only in New York City Transit.
As you come up to that blanket, you can see the guy's foot. He's one of the homeless guys sleeping there. This was posted actually on TikTok. But when you get to the inn there, that blanket starts to lift up and outrun 100 rats.
That's what I figured it was going to be.
If you want to know why, here it is, right? This is their sanitation department at work. There's garbage everywhere. They're in plastic bags out on the street. The bags are ripped, and you will find rats constantly when you're walking down the street coming out of their garbage. The garbage is ripped apart. It's put out in plastic. And then, of course, you end up having the union problems that New York has. And so oftentimes they can't get their garbage department out there to pick it up for whatever reason, besides the fact that it's really hot there. And what that ends up resulting in are streets that are a mess. Now, what that's done is it's created this really cool little thing. This is actually in the New York newspapers that you will find. It's created New York vigilante rat hunters. You can see the rats that are hanging. It's really just a sweet thing to see as you're walking underneath one of these freeways, and they're hanging there that they've been killed. They've got the dogs and all of them laid out in advance, but it's the version of hunting that they have in New York. Now, observation number 2. They're deeply concerned about businesses moving to Arizona. Certainly, we've had some big victories. We were able to get TSMC, the chip manufacturer here. There are a number of subcontractors that are kind of going to come from it. But there are companies that are moving here en masse. Now, if you want to know why, it's really not all that complex to figure out. For the most part, it relates to a society that has a lower tax rate and lower regulation. If you look at this slide, what you'll see is the guy is handcuffed down at the bottom. In Phoenix, we'd call this a picture of the mob. Now, what New York calls it is a picture of the building inspection department. Literally, their newspaper is full of stories of inspectors who took bribes in dealing with complaints or with permits. It happens year after year. Now, what you should recognize is that when you're talking about somebody taking a bribe, what you're really talking about isn't some guy that's getting paid off. It's the idea that other people who are interested in getting a permit or a permit process can't get it done unless they're willing to pay the same price. And if you want to know why, here it is. Look at the amount of regulations in New York versus Arizona. In New York, they are filled with regulations. It's the highest regulated state in the country. Arizona's down there at the bottom. What does that do? Well, the more regulations you have, the more inspectors you have. The more inspectors you have, the higher the chance you have for corruption. Being able to keep regulations under control is an important factor, and New York is at the worst level. He also talked about those Phoenix subdivisions and what it is that the challenges that that's created. Here's what you can buy in Phoenix, right? You can see the home up in the upper right-hand corner, the nice pool, the sunset that you can watch. But for the same price, here's what you can get in New York. You can get a walk up to the 5th floor in an apartment complex, right? So you can see the apartment complex, nice 5 floors that you have to walk up, and then all the fun things that you get to walk through in New York to be able to get there. Here's observation number 3, education. He talked a lot about the idea of charter schools. Now, I'm only going to pick out one school, which is BASIS. I'm a big supporter of Great Hearts and a variety of others. But what you'll see in the STEM ranking is that there are a number of charter schools, of BASIS schools, that have done very, very well in the country for STEM rankings. In this next portion, these are of all schools, of the top 100 schools. And I believe that they evaluated over 25,000 different schools, 18,000 of them in detail. And of the top 100, look how many of those come from Arizona. Now, in New York, you can get the same thing. They have a BASIS school in New York. The BASIS school that's there has a waiting line of people wanting to get in. It's pretty competitive. My son was there. He had to work hard to get his children into BASIS. However, there, the tuition and financial aid costs $43,700 to send them to that school. In Arizona, the tuition cost for BASIS or other charter schools, it's free. It costs you nothing. It's part of what we're able to provide people. You can get your kids into some of the best schools in the country, literally at no cost. Now, in free speech ranking, which is openness, tolerance for others, openness to speakers, the best schools in the country, 84th is the University of Arizona. 77th is Arizona State University. 16th was Northern Arizona University. Now, if you go to the worst, 214th was Columbia. 224th was New York University. 224th is Fordham University. Now, I put in the 234th here for Yale University, only because the guy who wrote the article went to Yale. We have 30,000 enrolled engineers, and that includes engineers that are involved in AI technology all the way to trying to figure out a way to get people to Mars. New York campuses, they're schools of radical ideologies. And you don't have to take that from me. Just watch your television set. You'll see this on kind of a regular basis. So the big question is, what are you teaching them? I mean, queers for Palestine, gays believing that somehow or another that Palestine is a better place for them than Israel or the United States. The real issue that we should be teaching them is about the gender apartheid that is taking place in the Middle East, and again, not in Israel. About what that means to women who are forced to wear burqas that they don't want to wear. Here, it's just simply the idea that there are women who are being oppressed. And if you put a real focus on history and you really talk about what's happening around the world, you will find that what is happening here and in places like Israel is dramatically better than what you're going to find in a place like Gaza. Now, Senator Rusty Bowers was defeated, and we're very proud of Rusty Bowers. Rusty was he was a Republican. He was Speaker of the House, but he was given the JFK Profiles in Courage Award because he was willing to withstand a tremendous amount of political heat to not overturn the election. Now, that cost him his job. It cost him his job because there were Republicans in the Republican primary that were mad at him. The author wanted to say that this was what caused it. The Arizona MAGA mob. And actually, there are certainly a couple of these people that actually did come from Arizona, although this is certainly happening in Washington, D.C. But if you want to know what really put the pressure on him, were two individuals. These are the two guys who actually worked to beat him. These are the guys that were calling him, putting pressure on him. We call this the New York MAGA mob, right? These are the guys that were calling him to defeat our person. So if you're worried about MAGA, you might want to start in the state of New York to figure out why the MAGA problem exists and not here. So I've put together a little agreement. I call it a consulting agreement. I think in New York, they call it a grifter agreement, to try and advise the government of New York as to how it is that they could actually make some improvements that could stop all those people from coming here to Phoenix. So here are my recommendations. Now, you missed the best thing that Phoenix has to offer. As it turns out, you undoubtedly would have missed it if you were analyzing New York. Because the thing that makes New York great, it's your people. If you think a city is great because of its skyline, its weather, or politics, then you miss the point. What makes New York amazing is its diversity and its vibrant population. Your achievements in civil rights, human rights, they're commendable. You've managed to get a lot of different people to live together in very, very tight quarters. They thrive in areas where they have freedom, like art and theater and music. But your people want to be innovative and they want to be creative. But here's the bad news. What you're doing is unsustainable. Sky-high rents, massive taxation, government overspending, they're crippling your city. And despite all of this, you have rats the size of small dogs. We may be hot in Phoenix, but at least we don't have to dodge mountains of trash during garbage strikes. Your streets look like the opening scene of a post-apocalyptic movie. The creative minds who could solve these problems, they've been stifled by heavy regulations. So here's how to fix it. Start with this. Get off their backs. Blow apart your regulatory regimes. Contract out areas where you can create savings. Open up your schools to real competition. Lower your tax rates and quit punishing those people who are successful. Get your universities to hire more professors in engineering and business, science, and history. Hire fewer who focus on these divisive ideologies. Teach about the real impacts of Marxism and communism honestly. And if you're going to teach about the works of Marxism or Edward Said or Franz Fons, then be honest about how communism murdered tens of millions of people in the Great Leap Forward and in the gulags, or the extreme oppression of women and gays in Palestinian states. Debate the theory of Franz Fanon, who said, at the level of individuals, violence is a cleansing force, and juxtapose that with Martin Luther King, who spoke about not seeing others as part of some group, but instead to judge them by the content of their character. Get rid of regulations like rent controls that stifle supply and empower that incredible free market force that you have centered right there in your city. Somehow or another, New York City's mottos become, if we can't drive you bankrupt, we're not trying hard enough. You keep piling on taxes and red tape, and we'll keep welcoming your fleeing businesses with open arms and sunny skies. While we're lounging by the pool in our backyards, you're stuck in these tiny apartments paying more in rent for parking than we do for mortgages. All those regulations and taxations, you still can't get through a summer without a subway turning into a sauna or the streets looking like a landfill. So start with the simple things. Pick up your damn garbage and see if that doesn't get rid of those rats. You want to get rid of mobsters in your politics? Cut your regulations and reduce the amount of people that you need doing enforcement. Your parks, your open space, your shopping districts, and your theaters, they're amazing. But it's your people that are the most special. Phoenix and New York are both going to find their way because they have amazing people. But you want to know who's really at risk? You are. What the Atlantic did to Phoenix is systematic of why no one trusts the media anymore. A reporter came to Phoenix to try to do harm. We believe that you did that because you're terrified that people and businesses are leaving New York, and you hope to convince your people that Phoenix was some type of living hell while ignoring the problems right outside your front door. But the problem you should really focus on is the problem inside your front door. The ones where a group of elites decide who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. A group of elites who are more concerned about how to create their own view of a better world than they are about giving people information. A place where debate is stifled and where woke is sacrosanct. Nowhere is that more evident than in the New York media publications. It's not just because the New York media pushed for and wrote the stories that resulted in the burden of taxation and regulation. It's because you've moved from being a liberal media to an anti-liberal media, an illiberal media. Once you embraced illiberalism, it was only a matter of time where you would mimic those that you despised the most on the right. You stifle debate inside and outside of your doors. You have to be right about everything, and so you have to shout down any disagreement internally. The stories are clear from many reporters and columnists. If you ain't woke, you ain't staying. You worry about the Republican Party of America losing their principles. Well, I'm an independent, and I worry about you losing yours. You become the publication of the progressive elites. You simply are an echo chamber where illiberal interests can exist to find agreement with their own tribe. We know about the wrongs America has done, but you spend an incredible amount of time talking about a very dark version of America that never really existed. And what chance you had to convince Americans of those ideas that are meritorious, they're lost because you squandered your credibility through becoming the people that you despise the most. It seems that the only hell that exists is the one that you helped create. Now, as an independent, I wish that wasn't so, because we need a robust discussion from all sides, and we need a media that will help facilitate ideas. As an optimist, I have to hope that you'll try and find a better version of yourself, that you'll give up trying to sell us on your view of a better world, and instead go back to giving us the truth, allowing us to decide. So, in any event, my point here is that if you compare us to New York, it doesn't take long to figure out why it is that people are moving here and companies are moving here. There's a lot to be offered in Phoenix. And if this is the future of the country, I think the country ought to be very happy with it, because it means that they're going to have jobs and there's going to be economic progress. But we shouldn't lose sight of why. The why in this, to me, is very clear, which is the amount of regulations, taxation, the inability to deliver basic services that are needed at a local level. Those become paramount to being able to be successful. We're going to be successful at dealing with our water problems and the other issues because we're not as spread out as New York is. We're not in a position where we have an economy and a government that just quite simply isn't sustainable. So I'll leave last comments for Bob and for Henry. Henry, you first.
Paul, I very much enjoyed that promo for Phoenix and Hit on New York. I thought that was great, and I totally agree. And the title of the piece was correct. The U.S. population is moving to the southwest. It has been for decades, maybe even since the nation's founding, and I think that move is accelerating. So as that happens, despite the heat, despite the supposed water problems, I think that this particular author is just going to be proven wrong with every passing year.
Arizona, and particularly the Phoenix metro area's defining characteristic has been opportunity. And that opportunity is protected by the things that you described, Paul. Reasonable taxation, reasonable regulation, and as your slideshow illustrated, honest government. Those are our virtues. They aren't a promised birthright. It's something that we need to constantly remind ourselves that that's why people move here. That's why we have opportunity, and to work hard to preserve them. And I also think that we have been distinguished in the past by problem-solving, pragmatic leadership within our government. I do think that we are at risk of slipping on that particular measure. And we shouldn't take what we have for granted, but it is fun periodically to say, take that, New York. Although I'm not sure the Phoenix Suns, New York Knicks comparison works as much anymore.
Yeah, well, they have been kicked out of they haven't made the playoffs for, I forget how many it was, 15 out of 20 years. They've missed being able to make it to the playoffs. I'm going to be a Suns fan. Literally, it was the only sports team that we had in Arizona when I was growing up. It took us a while before it was the Suns or ASU. Those were the two teams that you could go watch. I remember Frank Cush was our coach back during those years when I was in grade school and high school. To me, the key is you always have to compare it, right? We have to compare Phoenix to New York to figure out, is Phoenix really a good place to be? We should also compare Phoenix to Dallas and Phoenix to LA, and they should compare themselves to us. We should look at what we can do better and not worse. And if you want to figure out if it's working, just ask yourself this question: are people going there? Because if people are going there, that's a big sign that it's working. The same is true with the United States. Where does money want to go and where do people want to go? Larry Summers made that comment to me. He said, as long as those two things stay in our favor, you know that the United States is in great shape. There's nobody rushing to get into China or Russia. It's just not happening. This is still the place that people from all over the world want to go. I think one of our advantages is that we have 50 states because it kind of forces all of us to look at what's going on in our area and to figure out how we can do better. I agree with you, Bob. The way that we've been able to maintain that, though, has been through keeping a smaller size government, having less regulations, lower taxation, and still trying to do the job that needs to be done on things like education and the environment, water, and other issues.
Just maybe something like the Atlantic article, and I think this was partially true of the Barron's article as well, can serve to remind us of what we have and do a better job of protecting it. I continue to be worried about our ability to maintain the kind of political leadership that the state has enjoyed for most of its history.
I agree.
Apparently, one of the problems with this podcast was we all agree with each other too much. And I think this is definitely going to be one of the low points of the podcast from that perspective. We need to fight more. That's what people want to see.
All right, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Yep. Well, we'll figure out how to get a fight, especially, Henry, if you get this next book going where you're going to be interviewing, hopefully, people that will come on the podcast. That'd be a blast. You want to tell people about your new book coming up or the one you're trying to focus on right now?
Well, I'm trying to write a book about the rise of the radical right in Arizona, and I'm hoping that we can have people on the podcast who can talk about that and help me with my research and build some buzz for the book. And we got two good people to talk about that right here, so more to come.
All right. Thanks, guys.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.